In this video, I'll show you how to connect to the Kinde Management API and how to test the endpoints using Postman. So to start with, if we sign into the Kinde admin area, and then we can generate a client ID and a client secret that we can use to connect to the API. So once logged in, go to Settings, Applications, Add Application, then choose Machine to Machine, which we use for backend processes. Give the application a name and then click Save. On the next screen, you'll be provided with a client ID and a client secret that we can use to connect to the API. So the final step is to go to APIs and then just enable the Kinde Management API for the app that we've just created. Then click Save. If we then go back to the details screen, and we can now use the app keys provided here in Postman to connect to the API. So we can now move over to Postman. Postman has a concept of environments which you can use to store multiple variables to reuse throughout your requests. So I'll just start by creating a new one called Kinde Production, and then we'll create 3 variables with client ID, client secret, and domain. So we can then go back over to the Kinde admin area and then copy each one of these variables into the initial value. So that's the domain, client ID, and client secret. Okay. So then over on the right hand side here, you can see we can now select the environment that we've created, and that will just mean that for all the requests that we do, it will use these variables. Now that we've set up our environment, we can create a new collection, which is a way of grouping requests. So I'll create a new one here called Kinde API, and then within that we can create a new request. So if you go to kinde.com and see resources Kinde API, and here you'll find the full list of endpoints that are available. So to start with, I'll go to users, list users, and then just copy the endpoint from there. So if I paste that into Postman, and then you'll just need to prefix that with the domain variable that we set up for the environment. And lastly, we can just give the request a name such as get users. Next, if you go to the authorization tab and then choose type of OAuth 2, and then there's a few things that we'll need to configure here. So the first is the access token URL, which should be defined as your domain /OAuth2/token. Client ID should be client ID defined for your environment, and same for the client secret. Lastly, under the token request, you'll need a key of audience, and the value should be set to your domain/API. So if everything's configured correctly, we can now click Get New Access Token, and it should say Authentication Complete. It can proceed, and now you can see the access token that's been returned by Kinde. If you click to Use Token, then that will then get copied up here, and that will be sent along with the request that we can make to get the users. So if we now click Send, that will make our GET request, and here we can see we've got invalid content request. So one additional step we need to make for making requests is to go to the Headers tab, and you'll see here Accept is set to everything. If you switch that off and add a new key with the same name of Accept and set that to application/JSON. So if we try that again, and that's now got an OK success, and we've got an array here of our users. So we're now successfully connecting to the API, making a request and getting a response. So lastly, I'll just demonstrate some of the other request methods that you can use with the API. And I'll start by saving that request, duplicating that one, and we'll try getting the organizations. So if we refer back to the documentation, we can go to organizations, list organizations, and then copy the endpoint paste that back into Postman. We can then go to the authorization tab, request a new token. And if we want to reuse the tokens between requests, so we're not having to get a new one each time, we can give this token a name, for example, token Kinde API. And then at the top, you'll see that's now an option on the dropdown. So if we send that request, we then get a list of organizations back, and that's got my default organization and a custom one that I've set up. So I'm now going to add another endpoint, and we'll try getting the users that are specific to my custom organization. So I'll duplicate that one again, rename that to get organization users, and back to the documentation, list organization users, copy that one, and once again prefix that with domain. You'll notice here that the OR code is also part of the request URI. So if we go back to the organization response, we can copy the code and then paste that into the request. Okay, we can now go to the authorization tab and use the token that we've already saved and then make the request. Okay, so we can see there that there's currently no users listed against that organization. So for the next request, we can try posting a user to the organization. So I'll duplicate that once more and call this one add organization user. And in the documentation, add organization users endpoint. So this one is the same, but it uses a post method instead. So if we change our get to a post and make sure that we're using the same token, and then we need to populate the body with the user data that we want to send. So if we go back to the documentation, there's actually an example here on the right hand side. So if we take the input body, copy that across, and then the first thing we need is a user ID. So if we go back to our original get users request, we can take this user here called beta2 and paste that into the ID. And for now, we'll just leave the roles and permissions, but that allows you to define those for the user when you're adding them against the organization. And then finally, before we send that request, we need one additional header, which is the content type. And that should also be set to application JSON. Okay, so if we now send that request, we've got code OK and users added, and that should match up with the user we just sent there. So if we now make the get organization users request again, we would hope that that is now populated against the organization user. And lastly, we're going to duplicate that request one last time, and we'll rename that one to delete organization user. And if we refer back to the spec, we can see we have remove organization user, which has the same endpoint but with the user ID on the end, and it uses a delete method. So if we copy that request and we'll paste that in here, prefix it with domain, replace the OR code with the custom one, and we'll replace the user ID with the user that is allocated to that organization. Then we just need to update the method to delete, use the token that we saved earlier, and then make the request. And we've got success, okay, user successfully removed. So if once again we get the organization users, we would expect this to then disappear. So we've now successfully created get, post, and delete requests to the API, and you can use the documentation to create more.